Hi, I'm the man who was brought to a party just to be humiliated. My wealthy fiancé told me I was the guest of honor, but when I arrived, they didn't even save me a seat. They laughed about me behind wine glasses, called me her little project, like I was some charity case she picked up off the street. And the worst part, she didn't stop them. She just watched, like I was the joke they all agreed to tell. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't break anything. But I remember every word they whispered when they thought I couldn't hear. Now tell me, would you still love someone who lets the whole room tear you down just to keep their place in it? They say you can tell a man by his hands. Mine are rough, scarred, with calluses built up like old armor. I lay bricks, pour concrete, and spend more time outdoors than most people spend in their cars. Every morning, I rise before the sun. The ache in my shoulders reminds me that I've earned every penny the hard way. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. My fiancée, Celeste, lives in a different world, one with polished wood floors, catered brunches, and conversations I mostly smile through without saying much. I'm not ashamed of who I am, but when I'm with her, I feel like a guy who wandered into the wrong theater halfway through the movie. Still, I try. I care about her. I tell myself love bridges gaps like ours. One Thursday afternoon, as I was rinsing dust off my forearms in the kitchen sink, Celeste walked in, sipping something iced and green. "Oh," she said with a toss of her hair, "I forgot to tell you. My family's throwing a little get-together next weekend. You should come." That was it. No envelope, no RSVP, no details. I looked up. "Next weekend?" "Yeah." She smiled, but there was something in her tone, something light. Teasing, maybe. "It'll be fun. You'll finally meet my uncles and cousins. They've been dying to meet the guy who fixed the retaining wall himself," she said, with finger quotes and a little smirk. I wiped my hands on a towel and gave her a half smile. "All right, sounds good," she added. "It's cocktail attire, nothing crazy. I know you don't have much in that department, but don't worry. You'll stand out in a good way." There it was, the smallest cut, so casual it might have gone unnoticed if I hadn't been paying attention. "Stand out," I repeated under my breath. I wondered if she realized how it sounded. Maybe she did. Maybe that was the point. I laughed softly, just enough to match her tone. "I'll figure something out." She leaned in, kissed me on the cheek, and said, "People will love you." But the way she said it, it was like she was convincing herself, or maybe trying to convince me of something she didn't quite believe. Later that evening, I sat on the porch with a beer, staring at the soft orange sky. I thought about her family, lawyers, financiers, board members. I imagined the looks I'd get, the awkward small talk, the way someone like her cousin Sterling might say something like, "You're the handyman, right?" with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. I should have said no. That would have been easier. But instead, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Celeste loved me. That had to mean something. We'd been together nearly a year. If I let a comment or two throw me off, wasn't that just my insecurity talking? The next morning, as we passed in the hallway, she added, "Oh, don't worry about the seating arrangements. You'll have a place." She said it like it was nothing, like I might have thought I wouldn't. I froze for just a beat. "Of course," I replied. But inside, the words hung there. "You'll have a place." Why wouldn't I? That sentence stuck with me more than anything else she said. It didn't sound cruel exactly, just distant. As if I needed to be reassured I'd be allowed in the room, That night, I stood in front of my closet, thumbing through shirts. Nothing close to cocktail attire. I'd have to borrow something or run to the outlet store this weekend. Celeste didn't say much about the party after that. It was like she'd done her part by mentioning it and expected me to quietly prepare myself, like I was gearing up for a job interview I never applied for. I told myself it wasn't worth making waves. A party's just a party. One awkward evening, then done. But part of me already knew. Something about the way she said it all, too sweet, too casual, felt rehearsed, like the whole thing was more performance than invitation. Still, I said I'd go. And once I make a promise, I keep it, even if I'm walking into a room where I already know I don't belong. Even if the invitation wasn't really about welcoming me at all. I sat there long after she went to bed, the sound of the fridge humming louder than usual. I don't know why that sentence, "You'll have a place," bothered me the way it did. Maybe because it told me more than she realized. Or maybe she knew exactly what it meant. I stared at the TV, not really watching. A rerun of some courtroom drama flickered across the screen. People in suits shouting over each other, pretending justice was about facts and not influence. I turned it off. In the morning, I tried to shake it. Told myself I was reading too much into things. I had work to get to. Dan needed help framing the new porch over on Lincoln Drive, and I didn't have time for overthinking. But by that evening, 2 days before the party, the unease crept back in. After I showered off the day's dust, I stood in front of the closet. I already knew what was inside. A few worn button-downs, work jeans, one blazer that didn't quite fit right across the shoulders, last worn at my cousin's funeral 5 years ago. Celeste had said cocktail attire. Her words were airy, like it was no big deal, like every guy had a selection of tailored slacks just hanging around. I pulled out the blazer, tried it on, and looked in the mirror. It didn't feel like me. I checked my account on my phone. The numbers weren't where I wanted them to be. Rent had just gone through, and with gas and groceries the way they were, dropping $200 on clothes for one night didn't sit right. I could make it work, sure, but it'd mean skipping a few other things. I thought about asking Celeste if I could borrow something. Maybe her dad had an old jacket that would pass. But the second I imagined that conversation, her raised eyebrows, the awkward silence, I dropped the idea. That night over dinner, she brought it up again. Casual, like always. "Don't forget, it's at 6. Valet starts at 5:45. "Valet? Of course." I nodded. "Right." She took a sip of her wine and glanced over at me. "You figured out what you're wearing?" "Still working on it." She smiled, but her eyes flicked down to my t-shirt. "Just remember, first impressions matter. These people are important." "Right," I said, keeping my voice even. "I mean, I know you'll look fine. Just don't overthink it. That's what people say when they've already judged you and want you to pretend they haven't." She went back to her salad like she hadn't said anything at all. Later that night, as we were brushing our teeth side by side, she said, "Oh, and don't worry about Sterling. He makes dumb jokes when he's nervous." I hadn't even mentioned Sterling. I just looked at her in the mirror, so now I was being warned ahead of time. Preemptively asked not to react. I went to bed with a heaviness in my chest I couldn't name. I wasn't angry, at least not in a loud, throw things kind of way. It was quieter than that. A slow erosion of dignity that started with small things. The next day, I stopped by a consignment store on the way home from work. A woman there helped me find a navy blazer and some slacks that didn't look like they belonged to someone's grandfather. They were a little snug, but they worked. As I waited at the counter, I realized something. I wasn't buying clothes to feel good. I was buying a costume, something that might get me past the door. On the drive home, it hit me. This party wasn't about meeting the family. Not really. It was about showing them I existed, but only on their terms. I wasn't being invited as myself. I was being invited as a footnote, a contrast. The kind of story someone like Sterling could bring up over drinks. Celeste's boyfriend? Yeah, he builds things. Can you believe that? Part of me wanted to skip the whole thing. Say I had to work. Say I was sick. But another part, the part that had kept me standing through worse, wouldn't let me back out. They wanted a performance? Fine. I'd show up. I wouldn't smile too wide. Wouldn't speak unless spoken to. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of watching me squirm. I wasn't going to vanish just because I didn't fit. They wanted me there as a reminder of what didn't belong. Then I'd show them exactly who I was. I pulled up to the estate 15 minutes early. I figured arriving ahead of the crowd might help me find my footing before things got loud. The sky was already slipping into deep blue, and the trees lining the circular driveway cast long, quiet shadows across the gravel. A valet, young, well-dressed, polite, opened my door before I could even kill the engine. "Evening, sir," he said with that effortless tone people in uniform seem trained to have. I handed him the keys and stepped onto the pavement, my shoes feeling stiffer than I remembered from the consignment store. The house was bigger than I'd pictured. Not just large, designed to feel intimidating. Stone arches, tall windows glowing warm like candles inside. I adjusted my blazer, tugged once at the collar, and walked toward the entry. Inside, laughter floated up from the hall. People stood in small clusters, wine glasses in hand, already mid-conversation. I recognized none of them. A woman in pearls nodded politely as I passed, then turned right back to her group before I could return the gesture. Celeste found me near the entry table. "You made it," she said, pecking me lightly on the cheek. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "You look great," I told her, and I meant it. She was wearing something silver, elegant, like she'd stepped out of one of those magazine spreads she always left open on our coffee table. She glanced down at my outfit. "You clean up well," she said with a grin that I couldn't read. Before I could respond, someone called her name from across the room. "I'll find you later," she said, already half turned away. I drifted toward the bar. The guy behind it was professional, fast, and didn't ask questions. I asked for a club soda, figured I'd keep my head clear. He slid it over and nodded once, moving on. I found a quiet corner near a painting of a sailboat and pretended to study it while sipping. A few guests passed by, offering small nods or distracted smiles. One man asked what I did for work. I told him, contracting, mostly residential builds and repairs. His expression didn't change, but the air around him did. "That's hands-on," he said. Then, "Excuse me," as he spotted someone else across the room. No one was rude. That's what made it worse. They weren't rejecting me with words, just gently folding me out of the conversation. After what felt like an hour, someone from the event staff began calling guests to dinner. Celeste was already seated, surrounded by people in navy suits and black dresses. I stood near the dining room threshold, scanning the long table. That's when I saw it. My name card, handwritten, slightly off-center, placed at a small round table near the window, separate from the rest. There were only 2 other cards there, one for Mr. Doyle, whom I didn't recognize, and another left blank. I walked over and sat down. The chair creaked slightly. The view from that corner was nice, if you liked looking at the back of other people's heads. I tried to laugh it off in my head. Maybe it was a space thing. Maybe they ran out of room. But then I heard a voice behind me, low but not low enough. Well, at least they're expanding the guest list. Bit of socioeconomic diversity never hurt. Soft chuckles followed. My ears burned. Another voice added, Celeste always was a patron of the arts. Or was it craftsman this time? I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. In that moment, it was all clear. I wasn't here to meet anyone. I was here to be seen, to be contrasted, compared. A subtle reminder of how far someone could reach down and still make it look like charity. I thought about standing up, about walking out. But I knew if I did, I'd only give them what they wanted, a scene, a headline for their dinner conversations. So I stayed. I picked up the fork, pushed food around the plate. Every now and then, someone passed my table, nodded, didn't stop. Celeste caught my eye once, smiled, turned away again. The food tasted fine. The company was quiet, and the joke, it seemed, was still running. I stayed in my chair, but something in me quietly stood up. I didn't leave the chair, didn't flinch, but something inside me was no longer playing along. The conversations around me kept rolling. Names I didn't recognize, deals I didn't understand. But I wasn't just listening anymore. I was watching, tracking how certain words got used, how certain glances always landed on me like I was an unspoken part of the entertainment. A man from across the table leaned in at one point and asked, with an easy grin, "So, Celeste tells me you work with your hands? Carpentry?" I nodded. Contracting, mostly. Kitchens, floors, some remodels. He smiled wider, as if he'd caught a clever pun. Well, that's honest work, right? In a world full of spreadsheets and software, it's refreshing. Refreshing, like a novelty soda, like I was here to break up the tech crowd with something rustic and salt of the earth. Later, I overheard someone say, "It's so brave, you know, bringing someone like him into this world." Brave? As if I were some mountain to be climbed. Or worse, some project to be shown off. Even when they addressed me directly, they avoided my name. I became Celeste's guy, or the contractor. I noticed it over and over. Tiny edits in speech, subtle omissions. No malice in their voices, just polish. Like I didn't fit the tone of the room. By dessert, I'd had enough. I got up and found Celeste standing near the garden door, surrounded by 2 women and a man in a suit that probably cost more than my truck. She laughed at something he said, tossed her hair the way she always did when she wanted to end a conversation without looking rude. She spotted me, smiled, and excused herself. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Can we talk?" I said, keeping my voice even. She blinked, then nodded toward the patio. "Let's step out." We walked a few yards out into the cool night air. The garden lights made the grass look almost silver. I waited until we were alone. "I know what's happening," I said. She tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" I didn't snap. I didn't accuse, just said it plain. "They're not laughing with me, Celeste, and you know it." She gave a soft chuckle, like she thought I was being charmingly insecure. "You're imagining it." "I'm not." She folded her arms. "Look, they don't mean anything by it. They're just curious. You're different from most of the people they meet." "That's the point," I said. "I'm not here as your partner. I'm here as the contrast." Her expression didn't shift, not really, just tightened slightly at the edges. "This night matters to me, okay? These people matter. I've worked hard to be part of this." And I didn't? I asked. She sighed. That's not what I meant. I let the silence hang there between us. Then I said, quietly but clearly, you need to stop it. Stop what? The jokes, the placement, the introductions that leave my name out. I see it. And if you don't stop, I won't pretend anymore. There was a flicker in her eyes, offense, maybe, or maybe just fear of discomfort. She tried to smile again. You're taking it too personally. I nodded. Maybe, but that doesn't mean I'm wrong. She didn't answer, just looked past me, like she was already thinking about how she'd retell this to someone later, probably starting with, he got sensitive again. I left her there and walked back inside. The music had shifted, lower now, more refined. Dessert plates were being cleared. A fresh round of wine glasses appeared like clockwork. My seat was still waiting. The little place card hadn't moved. I didn't touch it, just stared at it for a beat, then sat down beside it, like it wasn't there. That card, that little rectangle with my name scribbled by someone who didn't know me, it said more than any of them had all night. I didn't raise my voice, didn't make a scene. But something had changed. I wasn't waiting to be accepted anymore. I wasn't mistaking patience for diplomacy. When they ignored my warning, they mistook patience for permission. I stayed at that table long after the wine had lost its taste, and the music had shifted to something smoother, less festive, more expensive. Around me, the room swelled with louder voices and louder laughter, but I felt further away from all of it, like I was watching a party on TV with the volume just slightly too high. I tried to keep my eyes focused on the centerpiece, some elaborate thing with glass and feathers, but my thoughts kept drifting. I nodded when people spoke, smiled when I was expected to, but it was like my face was moving separately from the rest of me. The man next to me leaned over at one point, holding a half-empty glass. Man, you must get such a kick out of being here. Totally different world, huh? I nodded again, that same hollow smile, but his words just echoed, barely landing. I didn't have the energy to correct him, or care. Because the truth was, I wasn't angry, not in the way I'd been earlier. What I felt now, it ran deeper, quieter, like a slow leak in something I used to think was solid. It was me I started questioning next. Maybe I had been too sensitive. Maybe Celeste was right. Maybe I was just looking for trouble where there wasn't any. These people didn't mean to hurt me. They just didn't know any better. Or maybe I didn't. I glanced across the room, saw her standing with a group near the piano, laughing like this was the best night of her life. She belonged here. I didn't. And for a moment, I almost convinced myself that was okay. That maybe this was just the price of loving someone whose world didn't look like mine. That I'd never truly fit, but maybe that didn't matter. Maybe it was enough to be near it, even if I wasn't in it. I almost stood up to go find her, to say sorry for making things weird, for making it about me. Then it happened. I was rising from my chair when I caught a voice, sharp, but trying to sound casual. She's always been a fixer, the woman said. Another voice answered, lightly amused. Oh, I know. This one's definitely her biggest project yet. They both laughed. The kind of laugh you only hear when people think you're not listening, or think you won't understand. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I felt it in the back of my throat. That sting you get when embarrassment burns hotter than anger. I sat back down slowly, the chair creaking louder than it should have. My eyes blurred, not with tears, but with the weight of it all finally landing. They didn't see me, not as a man, not as a partner. just as a symbol, a contrast, a storyline they could sip wine over and feel progressive for accepting. And I had helped them do it by staying quiet, by being agreeable, by not wanting to make a scene. I stayed for another 15 minutes, maybe 20. I couldn't say for sure. The walls started to feel tighter. The laughter, though unchanged, hit differently now. More distant, more cruel. I stood up without a word and stepped out the side door near the kitchen. No one noticed. The night air hit my skin like water on overheated metal. I inhaled slowly, held it, exhaled through my teeth. Somewhere in the garden, lights twinkled in the hedges. A string quartet had moved outside, playing something soft, something expensive. I didn't walk far, just leaned against a stone column and stared out over the lawn. It was quiet out there, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt heavy, like silence wasn't rest anymore. It was weight. I didn't feel like fighting, didn't even feel like talking, just done. And in that stillness, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. My silence hadn't protected anyone. Not her, not me. It had allowed this. I thought restraint made me strong. That maturity was choosing peace. But what I'd really done was give them room to laugh, to use me, to turn me into whatever made their story feel more generous. That was the moment I understood. Staying silent wasn't strength anymore. I stayed outside longer than I needed to. The music drifting from the ballroom had softened a little, replaced now with a deeper rhythm. Voices laughing louder, drinks poured heavier. The kind of sound that told you the night had fully given itself over to indulgence. Out there, I could breathe. I could feel the cold stone of the terrace against my palms. It steadied me. I didn't rehearse anything. I didn't plan a speech. But I did something I hadn't done all night. Something subtle but unmistakable. I decided, and that simple act, quiet as it was, pulled me upright. I turned back toward the glass doors, walked in, and the moment I stepped inside, everything looked different. Not because the room had changed, but because I had stopped bending to meet it. I moved slower, straighter. My shoulders weren't hunched. My eyes weren't darting. For the first time all evening, I wasn't trying to make myself smaller. I didn't seek her out. I didn't care who was watching. I just walked the edge of the room, returning to the orbit of that ridiculous table with the crooked place card. There were still people around, some now looser with their jokes, others clinging tighter to whatever performance they'd brought. I made eye contact when someone glanced my way, not to challenge, but to stop hiding. And then it happened. A man, I'd met him earlier, he'd said something about venture capital and legacy businesses, lifted his glass as I passed and said, grinning, "Hey, you're the guy with the tools, right? You must feel like a caveman in here." Laughter, not cruel exactly, at least not in tone, but it landed sharp. I paused, turned, and I answered. "Actually," I said calmly, "I run a specialty engineering business that services high-risk infrastructure zones. I don't carry tools. I build systems that stop bridges from collapsing." The smile on his face froze mid-chuckle. I didn't wait for him to recover. I didn't try to soften the blow. I just looked at him until his eyes dropped. And then I walked away. That was all. No raised voice, no tantrum, just truth. Undiluted. But it rippled. I felt it the second I returned to the table. A shift in temperature. Not literal, but social. Conversations didn't stop entirely, but they changed shape. The laughter near me thinned. People started redirecting their questions elsewhere, like I'd broken a rule they couldn't name but fully recognized. It wasn't loud or dramatic. That's not how exclusion usually works. It's quieter. I became the space people looked past, the gap in the circle. Someone asked Celeste if I was always that intense. She laughed too quickly, then took a sip of wine without answering. Another woman whispered something to her husband, who glanced my way, eyebrows raised. I wasn't surprised, because now I wasn't playing along. I saw the pattern for what it was. This wasn't about one comment or one night. It was about the role I had been assigned: agreeable contrast, decorative disruption, harmless example. But the moment I stepped outside that frame, I became a threat. Not because I yelled, not because I demanded anything, but because I refused to be used quietly. From across the room, someone was watching me. I met his eyes, a younger man in a tailored suit, part of the financial world that floated above mine. He didn't look away. He just smirked like I'd amused him. And I understood in that moment, pushing back didn't earn respect here. It earned warning labels. Still, I stayed, because I needed to. Not for them, for me. I didn't care if they talked less, or smiled tighter, or offered fewer drinks. I wasn't here to be liked. Not anymore. I just wanted to see what would happen when I stopped asking for space and started taking it. I didn't raise my voice, but I'd crossed a line they never expected me to. The reaction was swift. It wasn't a wave, not a storm rolling in. It was sharper, more surgical. Precision exile. I stepped back into the center of the ballroom, and for the first time, it wasn't me who was shrinking. It was them who were retreating. Conversations paused when I passed. A smile froze here. A hand stopped mid-gesture there. The laughter didn't vanish. It just narrowed, moved elsewhere, carefully avoiding my orbit. They weren't ignoring me anymore. They were watching, and I knew the game had changed. At first, it was subtle. Someone muttered something near the wine table. I only caught pieces of it. My name, the word temperament, and a suggestion that maybe I'd had too much. A few minutes later, I overheard someone in a hushed voice say, "I mean, he's clearly not used to these kinds of spaces. That tension's been building all night." Another added, "Celeste probably means well. You know how some people love a project." My hands stayed by my sides. I didn't flinch, but inside, something old and quiet stirred. That's how it starts. Not with a lie, but with a story. Twisted just enough, they weren't calling me dangerous. Not yet. They were planting seeds, unstable, emotional, bitter. The kind of man who doesn't know how to read a room. The kind of man who doesn't belong, not because of who he is, but because of how he reacts. A woman I'd spoken to earlier, a lawyer, if I remembered right, turned away as I approached the dessert table. I reached for a plate, and the man beside her gently slid the tray closer to himself. A move so subtle, I almost doubted it. But I didn't doubt it. I saw it. All of it. The invitations dried up. No more questions about my work. No more polite nods or "what brought you two together?" Small circles closed when I neared. Chairs shifted. Not much, but just enough to say, "Not here." I wasn't a guest anymore. I was the risk. I stood by the far wall, sipping from a glass I barely tasted, and I saw Celeste across the room. She laughed at something the host said, hand on his shoulder, like none of this was happening. That, more than anything, made the room feel colder. Then came the moment they stopped being indirect. A man I hadn't met before. Gray suit, perfect part in his hair, the kind of confidence that came from years of being the room, approached me with a practiced smile. I saw it before he spoke. The trap disguised as concern. He didn't introduce himself, just leaned slightly closer and said, "Listen, I think it's best if you maybe take a breather. You seem a bit on edge tonight. A lot of eyes are on you. It's making people uncomfortable." His tone was soft, his volume low, but the blade underneath was sharp. I met his gaze. "Uncomfortable?" I asked, keeping my voice even. He shrugged like he was doing me a favor. "Look, we all have nights where the energy's off. Just saying, it might help if you stepped outside, for everyone's sake." There it was, the veiled threat. Wrapped in concern, dipped in plausible deniability. I looked at him a moment longer than was polite. I could have answered a dozen ways. I could have called out the hypocrisy, the double standard. I could have said exactly what was happening here, but I didn't. I nodded once. Then I walked past him without a word. Not because I agreed, not because I surrendered, because I saw something he didn't. He was sweating, not visibly, not to anyone else, but I noticed. His eyes flicked toward Celeste before he spoke. His voice had wavered, not in volume, but in rhythm. They weren't confident anymore. They were circling wagons, and people make mistakes when they feel cornered. I stepped out again, this time not for air but for distance. They thought I was backing off, retreating. But I wasn't walking away. I was watching, listening, storing every name, every phrase, every look that turned too quickly, or didn't turn at all, because now I understood the rules. When they feel exposed, they isolate the threat. They discredit. They deflect. But fear makes people sloppy, and sloppy leaves evidence. They thought I was retreating, but I was just waiting for the right moment. I stood near the edge of the room again, my back to a tall cabinet holding glassware that probably hadn't been touched in years. From that angle, I could see most of the crowd, but they barely noticed me. The music had softened. Conversations hummed back to life. Laughter rose in curated bursts. The temperature in the room had shifted, not just in tone, but in control. They believed the worst had passed, that their pushback had sent me into silence for good, and in that comfort, they began to slip. A group gathered near the fireplace. One man leaned forward as if about to share a state secret, his voice just high enough to draw nearby attention. "All I'm saying is," he began with a smirk, "when someone clearly marries up, it's good manners to stay grateful. You don't stir the pot. You smile, you nod, you know your place." Someone laughed. Another added, "He should have just stayed in the background." The whole room was doing him a favor. Then Celeste's name entered the conversation, followed by a phrase I'll never forget, delivered like a punchline. She always had a soft spot for underdogs, but even she can't polish that. I stepped forward. I wasn't angry. I wasn't performing. I was done waiting. I walked toward the group, slow and steady. A few eyes caught mine, but quickly darted away. The laughter faded, just a beat too late. No one moved. "I'd like to clarify something," I said, my voice even, "for the sake of honesty." A woman, someone I'd never met before tonight, opened her mouth, perhaps to redirect, but I didn't give her the space. I've been quiet most of the evening. I let the assumptions pass. I let the jokes land. I gave everyone in this room the benefit of the doubt. I paused. But just so we're all clear, I wasn't invited here as a pet project. The room was still. I wasn't dragged here out of charity or pity. I'm not Celeste's rescue dog. I'm her partner, and I've built a life on my own terms that doesn't need polishing. Someone near the back coughed. No one laughed. I turned slightly, letting my eyes move from face to face. I heard what was said earlier by the buffet about how I don't fit in. I heard the remark by the wine table about how passion can come off as instability, and I noticed how after I spoke up earlier, chairs moved, invitations dried up. That's fine. I took another breath, not shaky, not forced, just enough. I've spent most of my life navigating rooms like this, just from the edges, and I always thought, maybe the silence was mine to break. That if I just proved myself enough, people would make room. Another pause. But I understand now. Some rooms aren't built to include. They're built to exclude. Quietly, elegantly, efficiently. From the corner of my eye, I saw Celeste. She hadn't moved. Her smile was gone. I'm not asking anyone here to like me, or to accept me. But I won't let another version of me walk into a space like this someday and believe, even for a second, that they have to shrink to be tolerated. I turned. No one spoke. Not one sound. I walked back to my table, slow but deliberate. The music hadn't returned yet. No one reached for their drink. I sat for a moment, letting the weight settle, not just in the room, but in me. Then I reached for the place card. It had sat untouched the whole night, angled awkwardly like a visual whisper. I picked it up, and I moved it. Not to the head of the table, not to any symbolic spot, just to where it should have been from the start, centered, aligned. And then I leaned back. Not to rest, but to let it land. I didn't need the seat. I needed the moment. The room finally understood, but understanding doesn't erase what's already been done. There was no applause, no catharsis, just a different kind of silence than before. The kind that stretches awkwardly, unsure of itself. A few people stood in place, shifting their weight from one foot to the other like they suddenly didn't know where to look. I caught snippets of whispers, eyes flicking away when I glanced in their direction. Not one person looked me in the eye for more than a second. Celeste was still at the far end of the room, surrounded by faces she used to shine in front of. When she finally approached, she walked with careful steps, as if trying not to break thin ice. "I didn't think it would get like this," she said softly, searching my face for an expression I wasn't giving. I didn't respond. Not yet. She glanced back at the room, then at me again. I thought if I just let them get it out of their system, it would pass. They weren't trying to hurt you. That's just the way this crowd works. I let the words hang. There was no anger left in me. Just an echo of the choices we both made. She tried again. "I didn't defend you because I didn't think I had to. I thought you knew that That's the problem," I said, quiet but clear. "You didn't think you had to." Her eyes glistened, but she blinked it away. "You don't understand what it's like growing up around these people. Everything's unspoken. Everything's implied. If I pushed back, I'd just make it worse." I nodded slowly. "And if I stayed quiet, I'd just let it keep happening." So we both stayed silent. But only one of us paid for it in the room. She reached out, touched my wrist lightly. "Let me take you home." It was tempting, for the familiarity, the ease, but it wasn't right. "I'll call my own ride," I said. "No, please just..." "I need to leave alone, Celeste, not just physically, emotionally." That stopped her. Her hand fell away. Her mouth opened slightly, like she had one more plea left in her. But she didn't use it. She just nodded, almost imperceptibly. I walked out without turning around. The night had cooled. The air outside felt damp against my skin, but at least it was honest. No whispered judgments, no half-laughs, just the weight of everything sitting exactly where it belonged. I ordered a rideshare, waited by the stone gate. In the 10 minutes before the car arrived, I thought about the night, not in flashes, but in slow rewinds. I didn't feel proud. This wasn't triumph. This wasn't a movie ending, but it was over. The ride home was quiet. I stared out the window as trees blurred into neighborhoods, and neighborhoods melted into the sleepy calm of pre-dawn hours. When I stepped into my apartment, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I stood in the center of the room, letting the silence settle over me. This time, without discomfort. It was my space. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't shrinking inside of it. I sat down on the edge of the couch, slipped off my shoes, leaned back, and just breathed. There was no victory music, no feeling of revenge served cold, only clarity. I thought of all the nights I'd sat across from Celeste, smiling through comments that made my stomach twist. I thought about the stories I'd let others write about me just to keep peace, and I realized I wasn't angry at them anymore. I was done being angry at myself. There was no need to unpack everything, no need to dissect every look, every comment, every just a joke. I'd done that already, for years, quietly, alone. Now I just needed to live differently. I didn't regret loving her. I didn't even hate the people who'd humiliated me. They were what they were, but I wasn't going to beg to be seen again, and I sure as hell wasn't going to apologize for showing up. I walked to the small table near the kitchen, an old piece I'd sanded and finished myself. I placed my keys down, neatly, next to the bowl of loose change and receipts. Then I looked around at the home I'd built, on my own terms, with my own hands. Respect isn't negotiated at a table, it's shown, or it isn't. I didn't need their chairs anymore. I wasn't invited to belong, but I left knowing exactly where I do.